At a time when Hollywood celebrated youth as an inexhaustible fuel, Kristy McNichol had everything: early fame, roles embraced by the entire United States, and awards that many seasoned actors could only dream of. She appeared on screen with a composure rare for a teenager. Calm, dependable, as if she had been born to stand beneath the lights. Then she disappeared. No scandal, no statement, no farewell. The silence stretched so long that it became the central question itself. Why would someone at the peak of success choose to leave when every door was still wide open? Hollywood is accustomed to loud collapses. A quiet withdrawal is not something it knows how to process. Years later, as retrospective headlines tried to contain her disappearance within safe labels, burnout, pressure, health issues, something essential was still being overlooked. There are pressures that never show up on a shooting schedule, roles that exist outside any script. And there are secrets, which, if revealed too early, can end a career before the person living it is old enough to protect themselves. Kristy McNichol's story, therefore, does not begin with a professional failure. It begins with a double life, where outward success concealed truths that were not permitted to be spoken. To understand why she left Hollywood, one must look at what Hollywood refused to confront, the truth she carried with her for years, in silence. From a very early age, Kristy McNichol sensed a quiet difference within herself. It did not arrive as a clear concept, nor as an inner declaration she could put into words. It was simply a feeling of being out of sync, when the emotional patterns and forms of attachment that the adults around her automatically accepted as normal did not align with what she felt inside. At an age when most children were still navigating the world by instinct, Kristy had already learned to remain silent, not because she understood, but because there were no words available to explain it. The Hollywood of the 1970s and 1980s did not allow such ambiguity to exist in public. Homosexuality was not named. It lived in whispers, in insinuations, in averted glances. For a teenage star being carefully constructed as a safe role model for millions of American families, a single rumor was enough to destabilize contracts, shooting schedules, and an entire image meticulously shaped by the industry. Within that system, concealment was not a moral or personal choice. It was a condition for continued employment. The pressure, therefore, did not stop on set. Kristy was not only performing written characters, she was required to perform herself in everyday life. How she appeared in public, how she answered interview questions, how she stood beside others at events. Everything was calibrated to avoid sending the wrong signals. Each passing day became an exercise in control, controlling speech, eye contact, intimacy, even relationships that were not permitted to exist in front of a camera. This tension did not erupt into scandal. It settled, accumulated, and became a constant background pressure that no one could see, not even those who believed they were protecting her. In her private life, Kristy found a rare space where she did not have to perform. Her relationship with Elizabeth Brooks was not demonstrative, did not appear in the press, and was never publicly acknowledged. It was a discreet bond, a place where emotions did not need to be explained or legitimized. For Kristy, that relationship was not only love, it was a refuge, where she did not have to monitor every gesture, did not have to adjust herself to fit an image already fixed in place. In 1997, Elizabeth Brooks died of brain cancer. The loss unfolded outside the spotlight, without press releases, without official condolences from the industry that had once benefited from Kristy's presence. This grief found no outlet in work or professional busyness, because for many years, work itself had been the place where she was required to hide who she truly was. When she lost the one person who had known Kristy without a role, the emptiness left behind could not be filled by a new project or an invitation to return. After that turning point, the idea of going back to Hollywood no longer meant continuing a career. It meant re-entering a system where silence had once been a condition of survival, where what she had just lost had no place to be acknowledged, where everything familiar was bound up with the act of closing herself off again. From this moment on, every decision Kristy made, choosing a role, stepping away, or staying out, functioned as a reflex of self-protection, shaped by years of living two parallel lives. Many years after she had left the screen behind, when the name Kristy McNichol was no longer tied to shooting schedules or new contracts, she did something that previously had not been permitted. In 2012, Kristy publicly acknowledged that she was a lesbian. Not in a publicity-polished interview, not as part of a media campaign, and not on a red carpet accompanied by a pre-packaged narrative for the press. The information was released quietly, almost in direct contrast to how Hollywood typically handles late confessions. At the same time, she confirmed her long-term relationship with Marty Allen, which had lasted more than 2 decades. The two had lived together in silence for many years, long enough that their bond no longer required public validation, and long enough for Kristy to fully understand the cost of speaking before having the right to choose. The act of disclosure, therefore, did not resemble a traditional coming out. It was closer to a reordering, naming a life that had existed all along without asking for approval. Kristy did not frame that decision as an act of courage. She did not speak about herself more than necessary. Instead, she spoke of young people, those standing where she once stood, lonely, confused, and without language to explain their sense of being out of step with the world around them. Speaking out, in that sense, was not about correcting the past or redefining a public image. It was directed toward those who had not yet been able to rely on silence as a form of safety in an era when difference itself could become a professional sentence. The silence Kristy McNichol learned as she grew up did not originate under studio lights or in front of microphones. It had been there much earlier, a familiar reflex formed in her earliest years, when nothing around her allowed a child the space to choose or to explain. Long before she had to conceal her true self, Kristy had already learned how to withdraw in order to survive. She was born on September 11, 1962, in Los Angeles, but not the Los Angeles of cinematic dreams. Kristy's family did not belong to the privileged world of the entertainment industry. There were no connections ready to open doors, no carefully laid plans to turn a child into a star. Her mother, Carolyn McNichol, was a practical woman living under constant financial pressure. What she pursued was not fame for her daughter, but a level of stability sufficient to keep the family standing. Carolyn took whatever work she could find: office secretary, cosmetic sales, and later small, uncredited background roles on film sets when extra income was needed. This was not a path designed to enter Hollywood, but simply whatever was available to prevent life from slipping further out of control. In that environment, Kristy grew up with an early awareness that safety was never guaranteed and that care did not always come from adults. One day, with no one to watch the children and no alternative, Carolyn brought both Kristy and her brother Jimmy along to a small film set. For Jimmy, the space sparked excitement: lights, costumes, people moving with purpose. For Kristy, it did the opposite. Overwhelmed by the chaos, she withdrew, hiding in the car and watching from a distance, as if observing a world that was not meant for her. There was no sign of a destined moment in the conventional sense, only a child trying to keep herself removed from a place that made her uneasy. It was in that seemingly forgettable moment that someone on the crew noticed the two children and casually suggested they try commercials. It was not a formal invitation, not a dramatized discovery of talent, just a possibility mentioned in passing. But for a family that had to calculate every expense, that possibility was enough to be taken seriously. The auditions that followed did not resemble a dream nurtured from childhood. They unfolded as incidental opportunities, linked together by circumstance. Jimmy began landing steady roles. Kristy, quiet and guarded, stood out in a different way. She did not display the quick charm or confidence typically expected of children on screen. Instead, there was a quiet focus, as if she were completing a task rather than enjoying a game. The door that led Kristy into the entertainment industry opened through that chain of coincidences, without ambition and without protection. From the very beginning, work was tied to survival rather than choice, and in a world where everything arrived out of necessity, learning to be silent, to observe, and to adapt became the earliest skills she carried forward into the next stages of her life. From those chance auditions, work came to Kristy McNichol with increasing regularity. One commercial led to another, then television. The schedule did not explode overnight. It quietly filled every gap in the family's daily life. Jimmy continued to receive steady roles, fitting neatly into what the industry expected from a boy on camera. Kristy was different. Her presence did not draw attention through liveliness or charm. It carried a weight that was difficult to name, an emotional gravity that did not seem to belong to a child. On set, Kristy did more than recite lines. She brought into each scene a maturity beyond her years, as if she were already familiar with worry, hesitation, and silence. The spaces the script only hinted at. This was not a trained technique, nor a deliberate performance choice. It came from having to observe adults too early, to anticipate moods, to adapt constantly so as not to become a burden. Directors recognized this before Kristy herself could understand why she kept being called back. At 14, she was cast as Letitia Buddy Lawrence in the television series Family. The character was not an innocent child. Buddy was a sensitive, complex teenager, filled with inner conflict. The connection between the role and the actress required no explanation through acting theory. Kristy stepped into the part simply by remaining herself. The role quickly became inseparable from her name, shaping how the public would see Kristy McNichol for years to come. Off camera, her life did not follow the logic of a protected child star. At home, Kristy was not the one being cared for. She was the one who took care, cleaning the house, organizing daily routines, paying attention to her mother's worries. These responsibilities emerged so naturally, they did not need to be assigned. At one point, Kristy told her mother that it felt as though their roles had been reversed. The remark carried no complaint. It sounded more like a calm observation from someone long accustomed to that position. On set, Kristy did not carry the excitement usually associated with children entering the entertainment world. She did not dream of lights or fame. Acting to her was a job to be completed on time and to specification. She arrived early, prepared carefully, finished her work, and withdrew quietly, as if there were no room for spontaneity or excess. Those around her called it rare professionalism. For Kristy, it was simply the only way to keep everything from slipping out of control. Fame arrived alongside an increasingly packed schedule, along with the steady gaze of evaluation that became familiar. While Kristy McNichol's image was constructed as a symbol of early maturity and reliability, anything resembling childhood had no place to exist. There was no time for distraction, no space for harmless experimentation. Day after day, work filled what should have been the open spaces of a child's life, and that absence gradually became normal within the rhythm Kristy learned to accept. At a very early age, the pace of life Kristy McNichol had grown accustomed to in her earliest working years did not slow as she got older. It only accelerated. By the late 1970s, her face appeared so regularly that it became a familiar presence in the living rooms of millions of American families. Family was not merely a successful television series, it functioned like a steady machine, and Kristy was one of its indispensable pillars. When the Emmy nomination arrived in 1980, the public saw something rare: a young performer capable of sustaining emotional balance, never showy, never drifting off key, as if she were already accustomed to the weight of adult stories. What drew far less attention was the workload behind that image. Nearly 100 episodes were filmed before Kristy had even turned 18. The dense schedule left no natural pauses for her body or mind to recalibrate. Shooting days ran back to back, scripts were learned in silence, and heavy emotions had to be summoned again and again with nowhere to be released. The maturity audiences admired did not come from confidence. It grew out of a habit of carrying responsibility too early, a habit reinforced every time the camera lights came on. Alongside television, another version of Kristy was being shaped and pushed into public view. In 1977, she appeared on a music program with the Carpenters, standing on stage not just as an actress, but as a versatile entertainment figure. A year later, an album recorded with her brother Jimmy was released, followed by an intense round of promotion. Talk show tapings, appearances at well-known nightclubs, carefully arranged outings designed to sustain the image of a rising teen idol. Media coverage was constant, schedules were packed, and every appearance demanded a bright, approachable Kristy, smooth, untroubled, without visible cracks. Within that cycle, there was little space to ask what she herself wanted. Music was not an escape. It was another branch of the same machine. Recording sessions were wedged between shooting days, promotional trips followed one another, and exhaustion was masked by discipline that had long since become reflex. Stopping to breathe was never an option. The rare gaps were quickly filled with the next plan. Film appeared as another door, promising expansion rather than repetition. Her role in Summer of My German Soldier showed that Kristy could carry heavier, more complex stories, without relying on the likable shell of television. The film allowed her to reach deeper emotional territory, where silence and damage sat at the center. At the same time, less discussed experiences emerged, projects in which her role was cut entirely, erased from the final edit as if it had never existed. It happened quietly, without announcement, just enough to underscore that the industry owed protection to no one, not even its most beloved faces. These frictions did not slow Kristy down. On the contrary, she kept accepting roles, kept moving into an already crowded schedule. Saying no was not a skill she had learned. From family to work, compliance had always been treated as the safest way to keep things running smoothly. Each new project arrived more as a requirement to fulfill than a choice to consider. In that breakless rhythm, Kristy McNichol's career surged forward at a speed outsiders called success, while for the person inside it, the days formed a sequence with no room for hesitation, where decisions were made before their true weight could be felt. By the time she turned 18, Kristy McNichol had scarcely experienced a pause long enough for her body or mind to recognize where she was within that race. Little Darlings arrived at precisely the moment the industry needed a face to represent a new generation. Young enough to reach teenage audiences, mature enough to carry complicated emotional tensions. Kristy was cast not as a gamble, but as a certainty. The film quickly made an impact, was widely embraced, and fused her image with the coming-of-age memories of an entire generation. Yet behind that reception was a body long accustomed to functioning in a state of depletion. Standing at the center of a major film project did not feel like an opening or a release. It felt like another layer of responsibility added to an already overburdened foundation. Kristy entered the role with her familiar focus, met the demands of the shoot, and left the set without the sense of having reached a personal milestone. The question of what she herself wanted had never been given space. Everything moved by the inertia of years of non-stop work, where choice was routinely replaced by compliance. That habit did not form overnight. From very early on, Kristy learned to please those around her in order to keep things from falling apart. Diligence, obedience, readiness to comply became the safest language available. In her relationship with her mother, this was especially clear. Major decisions were rarely framed around, "What do you want?" They followed practical needs, preset schedules, what was deemed best at the time. Refusal was not rebellion. It was simply a skill that had never been taught. After Little Darlings, subtle signs of misalignment began to surface. Not public crises, but impulsive behaviors, quiet mischief, brief ruptures in the composed image that had followed Kristy since childhood. They were not meant to attract attention or to challenge anyone directly. They resembled instinctive movements of a young person trying to touch a life she had never been allowed to live. Fragments of innocence left behind in the rush to grow up too fast. Inside, the feeling did not register as rebellion. It felt more like a quiet rite of farewell for a childhood that had never truly existed. Amid shooting days, promotional schedules, and mounting external recognition, Kristy began to confront a nameless emptiness, where success was no longer enough to mask accumulated exhaustion, and where questions never before asked began to knock, slowly but persistently. The subtle instabilities that followed Little Darlings did not disappear. They carried Kristy McNichol into the early 1980s, where the pace of work remained unchanged, while her capacity to endure it did not. In 1982, a role with a lighter tone than what audiences had come to expect, unexpectedly became the focal point of public criticism. Not because the performance failed on professional grounds, but because it deviated from the carefully maintained image of reliability built over many years. For someone who had grown up measuring her worth through external response, that slip struck at an already fragile psychological foundation. Recognition was no longer a reward. It had become a prerequisite for feeling safe. Soon after, an overseas project pulled Kristy away from familiar anchors. Far from family and the environment she knew, structured by schedules and unspoken rules, a sense of isolation set in quickly and deeply. Sleep became fragmented. Nights brought recurring nightmares. Days passed in a state of prolonged tension. Moments that once required composure in front of the camera grew harder to maintain, and at times emotion broke through in the middle of work, impossible to conceal. The professionalism that had carried Kristy through years of strain now felt like a thin shell, insufficient to contain what had been accumulating for so long. The consequences followed in a way that could not be avoided. Shooting schedules were disrupted, then halted entirely for an extended period, nearly a year, to wait for a more stable condition. For an industry accustomed to operating at speed, that interruption was a rare signal that something had exceeded an individual's capacity, no matter how reliable that individual had once seemed. What unfolded no longer belonged to a single project. It exposed a prolonged tension between the image that had to be maintained and a person whose energy was steadily depleted. Looking back later, Kristy did not describe that period as a sudden accident. The acute symptoms were merely the visible release point of a long process. Work layered upon work without genuine rest. Pressure to preserve an image fixed since adolescence, and a constant fear that revealing even a fragment of her true self would cause everything she held onto to collapse. Within that structure, breakdown required no dramatic trigger. It grew out of the habit of endurance, of always moving forward even after the body and mind had sent every possible warning signal. After the extended hiatus, Kristy McNichol's return did not follow the familiar rhythm of a calculated comeback designed to reclaim status. The first projects she chose were clearly selective, as if each step were weighed to avoid reactivating the old cycle. A television film centered on American nurses during World War II allowed her to work within a restrained emotional space, where the weight lay in patience and resilience rather than sustained intensity. A few subsequent film projects explored different tones, not to prove anything new, but to test whether her body and mind could remain steady within a less demanding structure. This shift did not stem from ambition to recalibrate her image, but from the need to survive safely. The measure of success had moved, no longer consecutive peaks, but the ability to complete work without paying an invisible additional cost. Kristy approached roles with a new caution, keeping just enough distance to avoid being pulled back into the machine that had once exhausted her. Praise or media attention no longer guided her choices. They became external factors, acknowledged if present, but no longer decisive. Within that context, the sitcom Empty Nest emerged as a fitting choice. The production pace was gentler, the working environment stable, and the role of Barbara Weston allowed Kristy to appear regularly before audiences without carrying excessive emotional weight. The show quickly found its footing, ran for multiple seasons, and returned her to the living rooms of millions in a way that was far less pressurized than earlier years. Still, even within this seemingly safe structure, personal limits remained. When she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, events from years prior finally gained a specific name. The information did not arrive as a shock that overturned everything, but as a delayed explanation for recurring cycles of tension, collapse, and recovery. Her decision to leave Empty Nest midway through its 5th season was not driven by conflict or professional dissatisfaction. It was tied to placing health above the momentum of a successful series. Stopping this time did not feel like abandonment, but like an acknowledgement of boundaries that needed to be respected. Many years later, Kristy returned for the final episode of Empty Nest in 1995. The appearance was brief and unadorned, more a gesture of closure than an opening. There were no signs of a long-term return plan, no promises of continuation, just a moment sufficient to place a period at the end of a relationship with the screen that had consumed much of her youth, within a slower rhythm where presence was chosen rather than carried along. The brief appearance in the final episode of Empty Nest did not trigger the kind of comeback rhythm Hollywood typically expects. Instead, Kristy McNichol shifted into a quieter working zone where presence was no longer mandatory. In the late 1990s, she moved into voice acting for animated series, projects that allowed her to continue working without standing in front of a camera, without maintaining a public image, and without facing the familiar rituals of promotion. The work took place in enclosed spaces at a controllable pace where the voice could exist separately from a body that carried too many accumulated memories of exhaustion. That period also marked the first time Kristy allowed herself to speak openly about matters that had previously existed only in private. In 1995, she publicly addressed her mental health, not as an explanation for her absence, but as a way of naming experiences that had followed her for many years. Speaking out did not change how the industry operated, but it changed how Kristy understood herself, from someone who couldn't handle pressure into someone who had borne pressure far beyond reasonable limits for far too long. In a context where such stories were rarely discussed publicly, the acknowledgement unfolded quietly without a campaign or a message crafted for public consumption. By 2001, Kristy made a decision many had speculated about for some time. She officially announced her retirement. There was no major press conference, no carefully staged final role to serve as a ceremonial farewell. The reason was presented simply, centered on the need to stop rather than on any professional calculation. For Kristy, continuing to perform, whether on screen or in public life, had become a burden that outweighed the value of remaining visible. The decision was not about withdrawing with honor or preserving glory. It was about breaking a cycle that had consumed too much vital energy. Leaving Hollywood, in this sense, was not accompanied by feelings of rejection or missed opportunity. It unfolded as a conscious separation, where silence was no longer a condition for survival within the industry, but the necessary space to live a different life. As the lights receded and roles no longer occupied the center, Kristy chose to keep what remained for herself. Not to deny the past, but to stop trading health and identity for a pace of life that had proven unsustainable. After stepping out of the familiar orbit of the entertainment industry, Kristy McNichol did not try to fill the void with a loud substitute role. Her life slowed down deliberately, as if each choice were designed to avoid recreating the sensation of being carried along that she had known too well for years. Music returned, not as a new career branch, but as a safe space in which to exist. Kristy studied at Los Angeles Valley College, took music classes, and joined a choir, where her voice blended into a collective rather than standing alone under the spotlight. There, learning happened for pleasure and connection, not for expectation or the pressure to meet a public standard. Art-related activities continued to appear in her life quietly. Kristy participated in volunteer work connected to education and the arts, contributing time and experience without attaching her name to promotional campaigns. Work was no longer measured by a crowded schedule or media visibility. Instead, her days were arranged sparsely, with enough room to rest, to think, and to listen to bodily signals that had been ignored for far too long. One place that became especially meaningful to Kristy during this period was Hawaii. Its rhythm stood in complete contrast to Hollywood. Unhurried, deadline-free, ungoverned by the constant gaze of others. In open spaces where time seemed to move more slowly, Kristy found a sense of balance she had lacked for most of her working life. These trips were not about image repair or gathering material for new projects. They were simply a way of expanding her perspective beyond old frameworks. Kristy's present life is rooted in simplicity. She lives with Marty Allen, sustaining a relationship built over many years of quiet stability. Music remains, not on large stages but in private moments. Travel offers gentle movement, without the feeling of having to return and re-enter a grind. Silence, in this context, does not mean emptiness. It is a different kind of fullness, one in which each day no longer needs to prove its worth. When asked about the possibility of returning to acting, Kristy does not close the door with a definitive refusal. The answer carries the familiar tone of composure rather than hesitation, a never say never without a plan or expectation attached. In that voice, there is no longer the urgency to conquer, nor the fear of being forgotten. A return, if it ever comes, would no longer be about rescue or validation. And if it does not, her current life is complete enough that it does not require a comeback to stand on its own. The legacy Kristy McNichol leaves behind cannot be contained within lists of awards, episode counts, or the roles that once shaped American television memory. It exists instead in an unsettling yet enduring paradox. A brilliantly successful star who became an early testament to the psychological cost the system demands. Long before terms like burnout, child star trauma, or mental health entered mainstream conversation, Kristy was already living their consequences, not through manifestos, but through a quiet withdrawal. Her performances, especially in Family and Summer of My German Soldier, did not linger because of showy technique. They stayed because they felt real to the point of discomfort, as if viewers were witnessing someone place an inner life, still unnamed, directly onto the screen. That early maturity was once praised as a rare gift. Later, it came to be understood as a sign of a childhood compressed too tightly. Kristy's influence therefore extends beyond the image of a talented actress. She became a reference point for how the industry treats those who are too young, too compliant, too easily assumed to be able to handle it. The way Kristy left Hollywood further shaped that legacy. There was no loud collapse for the media to exploit, no carefully staged comeback designed to close the narrative on graceful terms. There was only a sequence of increasingly clear choices, slowing down, creating distance, and finally stopping altogether. In an environment where endurance is often equated with limitless tolerance, Kristy's decision to stop posed an uncomfortable question. Is continuing always an act of courage? Or does courage sometimes lie in refusing to keep paying the price? Today, as conversations around mental health in the entertainment industry have grown more open, Kristy McNichol's story is revisited with a different lens. It is no longer read as a career left unfinished, but as an early record of human limits within a system driven by speed and image. Her decision to come out, to speak about illness, and to choose a private life afterward does not rewrite the past. It clarifies what had always been there beneath the surface. Kristy McNichol does not need to return to complete her story. That story was already whole the moment she chose to live more slowly, to be seen less, and to be more honest with what her body and mind could allow. In Hollywood history, where many legacies are built on prolonged visibility despite damage, Kristy's legacy rests on a different choice, knowing when to leave so that the rest of life does not have to remain a performance.